April 18, 1943. Over Rabaul, New Britain. The sky was a deep, burning blue, the kind that seemed endless and cruel. Below, the Pacific shimmered like polished glass, serene, deceptive. Above it, engines roared. Captain Takeo Taka Watanabe of the Imperial Japanese Navy squinted into the morning sun, his Zero slicing through the air like a silver needle. His radio crackled with laughter. "Look at that thing," one of his wingmen jeered. "It's like a flying oil drum." The thing was a new American fighter, massive, lumbering, and unlike anything the Japanese had seen. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Its fuselage gleamed with polished aluminum, its frame thick and ungraceful compared to the sleek, bird-like lines of the Mitsubishi Zero. Watanabe smirked. "If that's their new weapon, the war will be over soon," he said, rolling his plane onto its side. "They can't even build something that looks like it can fly." The Thunderbolt was still climbing, engines howling like a storm trapped inside metal. It was big, too big, Watanabe thought. Heavy. Its wings seemed too short for its body. Its nose, bulbous and strange. He could almost imagine it dragging itself through the air. But then, it didn't drag. It climbed. Hard. American pilot Lieutenant Robert "Bob" Johnson pushed the throttle forward, his cockpit rattling under the strain. The P-47's massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine roared, drowning out his breath. Sweat stung his eyes as he glanced at his altimeter, 22,000 feet and rising. The Zeros were specks below, dancing gracefully, but he wasn't here to dance. He was here to fight. On the Japanese radios, laughter turned to shouting. The flying brick was climbing faster than they expected. Johnson saw the sun glint off the enemy's wings. "Here they come," he muttered. The first Zero curved upward in a tight spiral, light as silk in the air. The Thunderbolt followed, heavier, slower to turn, but it had something the Zero didn't. Power. Johnson yanked the stick back, pulled into a dive, and the P-47 fell like a meteor. In seconds, the Zero was gone, unable to follow. Its engine screamed in protest, wings trembling as it tried to chase. The Thunderbolt plunged through the clouds, then leveled off. Johnson flipped the safety off his 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns. The moment the Zero reappeared in his sights, the sky lit up. A wall of tracers tore through the air, shredding aluminum and flame. The Zero burst into fire, pieces scattering like falling stars. Watanabe's laughter was gone now. "Impossible," he breathed, pulling his stick hard left. "It shouldn't move like that." Below him, the flying brick banked and climbed again, as if daring the rest to follow. For the first time, the Japanese pilots realized the monster wasn't slow, it was unstoppable. Its armor shrugged off bullets, its engine roared through the climbs, and its gun spat death in streams too heavy to dodge. The P-47 had arrived. May 1943, over the jungles of New Guinea. The war in the Pacific had become a brutal tug-of-war between altitude and speed. Down below, the rainforest steamed beneath a heavy sun. Above, the air shimmered with heat and death. Lieutenant Bob Johnson's Thunderbolt, call sign Half Pint, rumbled through the thin air, escorting a formation of B-25 bombers heading toward Rabaul supply depots. His squadron had been briefed that the Japanese still underestimated the P-47, that they thought of it as a clumsy brute. Johnson smirked. Let them think that. At 27,000 feet, radar chatter broke the monotony. Bandits incoming, 3 o'clock high. Silver glints appeared against the sunlight, Zeros, closing fast. Within moments, the radio filled with clipped American voices. Keep the bombers tight. Watch your altitude. Thunderbolts, break formation. Johnson rolled hard to the right. The world spun, jungle, clouds, sunlight, tracer fire. A Zero streaked past, graceful and silent. He pulled into a shallow climb, using the P-47's greatest asset, its dive speed. The Zero turned sharply, arcing toward him, but Johnson nosed the Thunderbolt down and let gravity take control. The air screamed against the fuselage, speed climbing past 400, then 450 miles per hour. Inside the Zero, the Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Watanabe, tried to follow, and instantly regretted it. His airframe shuddered violently. His wings felt like they might tear off. The Zero's light frame simply couldn't handle the dive. He was forced to pull up, cursing. Below him, the P-47 plunged like a comet, alive, furious, uncatchable. Johnson leveled out low over the treetops, then pulled up sharply, looping behind the Japanese formation. His 8 Brownings thundered, chewing through a Zero's tail. The plane erupted into flames and spiraled toward the sea. In moments, the Americans had turned the fight. The bombers kept flying steady while the Thunderbolts hammered the attackers from above and below, shrugging off return fire that would have shredded lesser aircraft. By the time Johnson's squadron returned to base, they had shot down 6 enemy fighters and lost none. Ground crews gathered around the bullet-pocked fuselages of the P-47s, shaking their heads. Some holes were the size of fists, but the planes had brought their pilots home. Across the Pacific, Japanese intelligence officers studied the reports. They couldn't make sense of it. The Americans had built a machine that should have been too heavy to fight, yet it was carving through elite squadrons. Watanabe, grounded and silent, watched from his airfield as another wave of thunderbolts roared over the horizon. He had once called it a flying brick. Now, he called it the metal storm. The mockery was over. The fear had begun. Summer, 1943, Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. The airfield was alive with noise, wrenches clanging, engines coughing to life, and the sharp scent of aviation fuel thick in the humidity. Mechanics worked bare-chested in the heat, their hands black with oil as they prepped the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts for another mission. The men had started calling it the jug. No one knew exactly why, maybe because it looked like a milk jug, maybe because it could take punishment like one made of iron. But to the pilots, the jug was more than a nickname. It was a promise. Captain Bob Johnson climbed onto his plane's wing, running a hand over the dented aluminum skin. "You've still got some fight in you," he murmured. The last sortie had left a dozen bullet holes across the fuselage, one close enough to graze his oxygen line. Yet the aircraft had limped home, smoking, bleeding oil, but alive. Word spread fast about Johnson's last encounter. He'd survived an ambush by a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s in Europe just weeks earlier, taking 21 direct hits and somehow making it back to base. The Thunderbolt's armor, radial engine, and sheer brute strength made it nearly indestructible. To the pilots flying it, that meant something profound. You could make mistakes and still live to learn from them. That changed everything. Up to that point, air combat favored agility, who could turn tighter, climb faster, twist away first. But the P-47 rewrote the rules. It was built for power, not grace. When enemy pilots rolled into a turning fight, the jug refused to play their game. Instead, it dove, hard, fast, and straight, trusting its speed and armor to carry it through. And when it attacked, it hit like thunder. Each wing carried 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns, firing over 100 rounds per second. The combined sound wasn't a staccato like other fighters, it was a roar, like tearing fabric and thunder mixed together. The rounds chewed through aircraft, convoys, bridges, and anything unlucky enough to be below. In the Pacific, the Japanese quickly realized they couldn't win dogfights the way they used to. The Zero's light frame, once its advantage, had become its curse. It couldn't dive fast enough, it couldn't climb under fire, and it couldn't absorb damage. Meanwhile, the P-47s began escorting bombers deeper and deeper into enemy territory, extending their range with belly tanks and new tactics. Their dive-bombing runs became legendary, streaking out of the clouds, obliterating convoys, then vanishing before anti-aircraft guns could track them. For the Japanese, the Thunderbolt was no longer a curiosity. It was an omen. Pilots whispered about the metal demons that came from the clouds, planes too fast to chase, too tough to kill, and too loud to ignore. In a war once defined by elegance in the sky, the P-47 had introduced a new kind of beauty, the beauty of raw, unrelenting power. By mid-1943, the war in the Pacific was no longer the dance it once was. It had become a storm. The Americans were pushing further west, New Guinea, the Solomons, the Gilberts, and their squadrons now carried a new sound across the sky, a deep, thunderous growl that could be heard long before the planes were seen. The P-47 Thunderbolt had arrived in force. In the humid heat of the New Guinea airfields, pilots of the 348th Fighter Group wiped sweat from their brows as mechanics swarmed around the aircraft's massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine. The Thunderbolt's nose was so large it seemed to swallow light. But for men like Lieutenant Robert "Bob" Johnson, that monstrous front end was comfort. It meant survival. Bob ran his gloved hand along the side of his P-47, reading the name stenciled just beneath the canopy, Half Pint. It wasn't a beautiful aircraft, but it was a faithful one. He'd seen what the Japanese Zeros could do, how they twisted through the air like birds, how they shredded unarmored planes in seconds. But the Thunderbolt didn't need grace. It had power. When Bob climbed into the cockpit, the world changed. The thick armor plate behind him felt like a shield. The weight of the plane wasn't a burden, it was safety. And when the engine roared to life, it wasn't a hum. It was a physical vibration that lived in his chest. "Tower, this is Half Pint," he said into the radio. "Thunder ready to roll." At 27,000 feet, over the Solomon Islands, the P-47s met the enemy. The Japanese formation appeared suddenly, glints of sunlight on the horizon, Zeros, fast and elegant, slicing through clouds like knives. The Americans tightened formation, sunlight catching the olive drab paint of their heavy fighters. "Here they come!" Johnson's wingman shouted. The first wave dove, and tracers streaked past Bob's canopy. He rolled into a dive, one of the Thunderbolt's specialties. The airspeed climbed past 400 miles per hour. Then 450. Then 480. The altimeter spun wildly as the G-forces pressed him deep into his seat. But the plane didn't shake. Didn't protest. It cut through the air like a falling anvil. The pursuing Zeros tried to follow, but they couldn't. At that speed, their wings began to shudder violently. A few tried to pull up, but one disintegrated midair, wings snapping clean off under the strain. Bob leveled out just above the sea, barely 200 feet from the waves. He pulled the stick back, climbed, and turned into the attack. The Zeros that had survived the dive were climbing back toward him, their pilots still confident they could outmaneuver the heavier machine. But Bob didn't need to turn. He needed one shot. He lined up the reticle, and when the Zero flashed through it, he squeezed the trigger. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns roared to life. The cockpit filled with smoke and vibration, and a wall of lead streaked forward. The Zero vanished in a burst of flame and spinning debris. Bob didn't smile. He just exhaled. The mockery, the flying brick insults, felt distant now. Out here, in the chaos of sky and metal, speed and armor mattered more than beauty. Back at the airfield that night, the men were exhausted but alive. Someone passed a cigarette to Bob as mechanics refueled the planes under lantern light. The Thunderbolts looked battered, scratched, oil-streaked, but they had returned. That was what mattered. Word spread fast through the Pacific. The Japanese no longer mocked the P-47. They feared it. Reports called it the Thunder Devil, a machine that dove like a meteor and clawed its way back into the fight even after taking dozens of hits. Kudo heard those same reports at Rabaul. He saw the burned wrecks of Zeros come back on flatbeds, riddled with holes that told the same story. The Americans had changed the rules of the air war. He wondered how long the Empire could keep up. October 1943, near Wewak, northern New Guinea. The sky was calm, almost unnaturally so. Thin white clouds drifted like ghosts above the coastline. Below, hidden among palm trees and camouflaged revetments, sat one of Japan's most important air bases, a lifeline for their operations in the South Pacific. At dawn, the silence shattered. Thunderbolts came screaming out of the sky in a coordinated strike, 40 aircraft diving from 25,000 feet in near-perfect formation. Their silver bodies caught the sun, glinting like falling stars. Then the noise hit, the roar of engines, the hiss of wind, and the staccato thunder of 8 guns per plane. Lieutenant Watanabe was in the mess tent when the first explosions hit. The ground trembled, plates clattered. He burst outside and saw chaos, fuel trucks exploding, hangars collapsing, and Zeros erupting in flame before they could even take off. The air was thick with smoke and burning oil. He looked up, and saw one of them. A P-47 in a steep climb, wings shuddering from recoil as it raked the airfield with gunfire. Its insignia flashed in the sunlight. Then it was gone, rolling through the smoke and vanishing into the clouds. The attack lasted less than 15 minutes. But when the Thunderbolts pulled away, the base was finished, dozens of aircraft destroyed, the runway cratered, fuel depots in flames. Japanese command radioed a desperate warning: the Americans have a new machine. Heavily armored. Unstoppable. It wasn't exaggeration. The Thunderbolt's radial engine could take hits that would have killed any inline engine. It could lose a cylinder, even two, and still fly home. Its cockpit armor shielded the pilot like a steel cage. And its wings, though stubby, gave unmatched stability in a dive. That stability made it perfect for a new kind of warfare, low-level strafing runs. The P-47s would come in just above the treetops, their guns carving lines of fire through convoys and ships. Villagers miles away said the ground trembled when the flying bricks passed overhead. The Japanese began calling them Raijin, after the thunder god, half in respect, half in fear. Watanabe stood on the smoking runway hours after the attack, holding a piece of twisted aluminum, all that was left of a Zero's wing. He had once believed in the Zero's perfection, its agility, its almost spiritual grace in combat. Now, he wasn't sure if belief could stop thunder. The Americans had built a weapon that broke every rule of air combat, and still, somehow, conquered the sky. The mockery that once echoed through the radios had turned into quiet dread. Even the most loyal pilots began to whisper, if this is what their worst fighter can do, what's coming next? January 1944, over Burma. The war had shifted. Once, Japan had ruled the skies of the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Their Zero was the symbol of dominance, of precision, of agility. But by 1944, the skies belonged to thunder. The P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved from a curiosity into a legend. Its pilots were learning not just to survive, but to hunt. And the Japanese, who had once mocked it as clumsy and overweight, now watched it with the same wary respect they once gave to storms at sea. At dawn, the humid air over the Burmese jungle hung thick and heavy. Rain clouds rolled low over the mountains. Below, Japanese supply convoys snaked along narrow dirt roads, moving ammunition and rice toward the front. They believed they were safe beneath the clouds, too low for bombers, too remote for fighters. They were wrong. From the west, a squadron of P-47s from the 80th Fighter Group, the Burma Banshees, descended through the mist. Their engine notes blended into one long growl that made the treetops tremble. Each carried 500-pound bombs slung under its wings, along with rockets and the trademark 8 Browning .50 caliber guns. Major Don Lopez, leading the formation, keyed his radio. "Keep it tight, boys. Hit hard, hit once, and don't stick around to admire your work." As they broke through the clouds, the first convoy came into view, trucks, fuel drums, and supply huts clustered near the river. Lopez dove first. The P-47's nose dropped, the altimeter spun, and gravity pulled with brutal force. At nearly 480 miles per hour, the jug roared down, bomb bay doors open. The first explosion tore through the jungle with a deep, percussive thud. Then came another. And another. By the time the Japanese gunners reacted, the sky was already on fire. From above, it looked like a furnace opening. Dozens of thunderbolts swept through the valley, their machine guns tearing into trucks, fuel depots, and anti-aircraft positions. Bullets sparked off metal and tore through the foliage. The sound was a continuous roar, a hammering wall of sound that drowned out everything else. Japanese soldiers scattered into the trees, firing blindly. But the thunderbolts were gone before their rifles could be aimed. They pulled up, looped around, and came again, low, fast, and merciless. By the time the raid ended, an entire supply line had been erased from the map. And when the P-47s touched down hours later, several returned with wings torn and fuel tanks leaking, but none had been shot down. The flying brick, once ridiculed as too heavy to dogfight, was now the backbone of Allied air power in both Europe and the Pacific. But the transformation wasn't only in performance. It was in reputation. Across the Pacific, American pilots began to view the P-47 not as a limitation, but as liberation. It could take them deep behind enemy lines, bring them home through storms of flak, and hit targets that other planes couldn't reach. It was more than a fighter, it was a weapon of endurance. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine, capable of over 2,000 horsepower, gave it monstrous speed in a dive. Its turbo-supercharger allowed it to operate at altitudes the Japanese couldn't reach. Its rugged frame could absorb punishment that would have shredded a Zero or a Spitfire. Even when enemy fire tore holes in its wings, or when oil pressure dropped to near zero, the jug found its way back. Pilots joked that the Thunderbolt wasn't flying through the air, it was punching through it. And for Japanese pilots like Watanabe, who had once laughed at the American machine, the laughter had turned bitter. He now flew out of Truk Lagoon, once considered Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific. But American raids had intensified. Every week, more Thunderbolts appeared on their radar, leading bomber groups, strafing runways, attacking ships. They came from directions no one expected. They came in weather no one else dared to fly through. The Japanese command issued new orders: avoid direct engagement with P-47s in vertical maneuvers. Do not pursue them in dives. For a Zero pilot, that was unthinkable. Avoiding combat went against everything they had been trained to believe. The Zero spirit was agility: outturn your enemy, dance through his bullets, strike at his heart. But the Thunderbolt refused to dance. It fought like a hammer. In one engagement over Truk, Watanabe's squadron intercepted a group of B-25 bombers with Thunderbolt escorts. The sky was overcast, visibility low. As the Zeros attacked, the P-47s rolled over the bombers and dove straight down, guns blazing. Watanabe tried to follow, but the controls stiffened, the Zero couldn't match the speed. Within seconds, the jugs disappeared beneath the clouds. He pulled out of the dive, panting, the frame rattling. When he leveled out, he saw a scene that turned his stomach: smoke columns rising from the airfield, his own unit's planes in flames, and the Thunderbolts already climbing away in perfect formation. He whispered to himself, they fight like machines, not men. By late 1944, the P-47 was everywhere, escorting bombers over Burma, strafing supply lines in the Philippines, tearing through German columns in France. Its kill ratio was staggering. In Europe alone, it destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft. Its transformation was complete. What had started as a joke among enemy pilots had become one of the most feared sights in the sky. But its deadliest weapon wasn't its armor, its speed, or its guns. It was its reliability, the quiet, unshakable trust between pilot and plane. Thunderbolt pilots often said, "If you fly the Jug right, she'll bring you home." And she did, again and again, even when riddled with holes, bleeding oil, and trailing smoke. In a war defined by machines, the P-47 was something different. It was a survivor. As the war dragged toward its end, Watanabe watched from the ground as the distant hum of engines rolled over the horizon again. The sound was familiar now, a low, thunderous growl that made the earth tremble. He closed his eyes. There was no laughter this time. Only respect. The flying brick had earned its name, not as an insult, but as a monument. Heavy, unyielding, and unstoppable. February 1945, Philippines. The empire was crumbling. American troops were pushing through the jungles of Luzon, inch by inch, supported by the relentless growl of aircraft above. The Japanese once believed their skies were untouchable. Now, even the clouds belonged to thunder. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once dismissed as a joke, had become a storm that never stopped moving. Its thick frame and roaring engine now symbolized the changing face of war, industrial power, endurance, and precision wrapped in steel and fire. At dawn, over the city of Manila, the sky began to hum. It was a familiar sound by now, a deep, rhythmic vibration that made the walls tremble. Japanese soldiers looked up instinctively, shading their eyes. The sun glinted off the wings of a formation descending from the east. 30 Thunderbolts, flying in perfect symmetry. Captain Bob Johnson led the squadron, his plane's nose art, half-pint, faded and scarred. Below, the remains of Japan's once proud Air Force waited. A handful of Zeros, battered and worn, scrambled from hidden airstrips to meet the invaders. In the control tower, Lieutenant Takeo Watanabe watched the rising trails of smoke. He'd been grounded for weeks, fuel shortages, lack of parts, no replacements. The old confidence, once blazing in the hearts of Japan's pilots, was gone. They were outmatched in the air, outproduced on the ground, and outnumbered everywhere. But still, they flew. The first clash came high above the bay. The Zeros, climbing hard, tried to surprise the Americans from below. They rose beautifully, their engines whining as they reached for the sunlight. Johnson spotted them immediately. "Eyes open, boys," he said over the radio. "We've got company, let's make it quick." The Thunderbolts broke formation and rolled into a dive. The sound was deafening, 40,000 pounds of steel slicing through the sky at over 500 miles per hour. The Japanese pilots barely had time to react. One tried to roll away, but the P-47's guns thundered first. 8 Brownings opened fire in perfect unison, spitting fire and brass. The Zero's fragile frame disintegrated, bursting into a ball of flame that spiraled toward the sea. Watanabe's breath caught as he watched it fall. The pilots he had once trained, men he had laughed with, were being erased in seconds. He whispered to himself, "So this is how it feels, when the sky turns against you." The Thunderbolts pressed on, strafing airfields, bridges, convoys, anything that moved. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns barked from the ground, tracers flashing red through the haze. But the Jugs flew straight through them, their armor absorbing the punishment like fists against a wall. Johnson's plane took hits, 3, then 4. Shrapnel tore into the fuselage, oil splattered across the canopy. But the engine didn't falter. The P-47 roared on, defiant. He lined up another target, fired a burst, and watched a convoy truck erupt in flames. "Half-pint still kicking," he said with a grin. "You'll need more than that to stop me." The P-47's presence wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The Japanese called them Raijin no Tsubasa, the wings of thunder. Civilians would hide when they heard that rumble overhead. Soldiers on the ground said they could feel the vibration in their bones before they ever saw the planes. Even Japanese command began shifting tactics, abandoning open movements during daylight. The sky was no longer theirs. It belonged to the metal giants that came with the dawn. Meanwhile, back at base, the pilots of the 348th Fighter Group gathered in the humid evening, the air thick with the smell of fuel and cordite. The Thunderbolts sat in the fading light, scarred, patched, and silent. Mechanics moved like ghosts among them, replacing panels, refueling tanks, and wiping soot from the gun ports. A young replacement pilot, barely 20, asked Johnson quietly, "Sir, what's it like up there against them?" Johnson thought for a moment, eyes distant. "They're brave," he said finally. "Every one of them. But bravery doesn't stop bullets. What wins wars is what keeps you in the air, and this bird keeps me flying." He patted the side of his plane affectionately. The metal was warm under his hand. For the Japanese, the losses were beyond numbers. Factories back home struggled to replace destroyed aircraft. The once celebrated Mitsubishi plants were bombed into silence. The fuel shortages grew desperate. Pilots were sent into combat with barely enough gasoline to return home, if they returned at all. Watanabe was one of the few veterans left. He was ordered to fly again, this time in a last-ditch effort to protect a convoy retreating north. He knew what awaited him. As he climbed into the cockpit, the leather seat cracked beneath his weight. The Zero's controls felt loose, its engine sputtering unevenly. Still, he saluted the mechanic and pulled the canopy shut. The air inside smelled of fuel and fear. Minutes later, he was airborne, climbing toward a sky that was already rumbling. And there they were, the Thunderbolts, dark silhouettes against the rising sun. Dozens of them, flying in disciplined lines, sunlight glinting off their wings. He tightened his grip on the stick. "Let's see how gods bleed," he whispered, pushing the throttle to full. He met them head-on. Tracers flashed, smoke trails weaved, engines screamed. For a moment, it felt like the old days, the dance of skill, instinct, and courage. But the P-47s didn't dance. They struck like lightning and vanished. One burst hit his wing. Then another. The Zero lurched, smoke filling the cockpit. Flames licked at the engine cowling. Watanabe yanked the stick, struggling to control the dive. Below, the jungle rushed up to meet him. His plane clipped the treetops, skidded, and came to rest near a riverbank. The canopy jammed. He forced it open with trembling hands, crawled out, coughing. He lay there for a long time, staring up at the sky, the same sky that once belonged to him. Above, the Thunderbolts flew on, their engines fading into the distance. For the first time, he felt no anger. Only awe. Months later, as Japan's surrender echoed across the Pacific, the P-47's legend was sealed. It had fought in every major theater, destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other U.S. fighter, and proven nearly indestructible. Its pilots called it the Jug. Its enemies called it the Thunder God. History would remember it as both. The P-47 was never graceful. It never pretended to be elegant. But it didn't need to be. It was a brute force of will, steel wings, roaring power, and the refusal to break. As Captain Johnson wrote in his journal after the war, the P-47 didn't win because it was beautiful. It won because it could take hell, and come home anyway. For Watanabe, that sound, the low growl of the Thunderbolt, would haunt his memory for years. Not as the voice of an enemy, but as the echo of inevitability. The flying brick had conquered the skies.